Welcome to the Deep Dive. We're here to sift through the information and really get to the heart of things for you. And today we're tackling a question that, well, it touches many of us very deeply. What happens to children who die young? Specifically, before they really grasp right from wrong, before reaching what some call an age of accountability.
That's exactly our focus for this deep dive. We want to explore what the Bible suggests about this very sensitive and significant theological question. We'll be looking at different scriptures, some symbolic stories, even some frankly challenging narratives. The goal is to understand what these texts reveal about God's character, his justice, his mercy, especially regarding children. Think of it as a focused journey through various theological thoughts and biblical interpretations to get you well informed on this.
Okay, so let's unpack this term first, age of accountability. You've mentioned it's not a phrase directly lifted from Scripture, right?
That's correct. You won't find those exact words. But the concept seems deeply embedded in how God interacts with people throughout the Bible.
How would you define that concept then?
Basically, it's understood as the point when someone develops enough cognitively, morally, to genuinely understand the difference between right and wrong, to grasp what sin is, what God's holiness means, and to then make a conscious choice about their relationship with him. Before that stage, children are seen as, well, innocent in the sense that they haven't deliberately or knowingly rejected God. And the Bible gives us some strong hints about this.
Hints like what? Where do we see this idea surface?
Well, a key one is in Deuteronomy 1.39. God is addressing the Israelites after their rebellion in the wilderness. He tells the adult generation they won't enter the promised land because of their unbelief. But then he says something very specific about their children. He says, "And as for your little ones and your children, who today have no knowledge of good or evil, they shall go in there."
So a clear distinction based on their understanding.
Exactly. Adults held accountable, children not, explicitly because they lack that moral knowledge. It suggests accountability is linked to capacity.
Okay, that makes sense. Are there other places that echo this?
Yes, definitely. Think about Isaiah 7, the prophecy about Emmanuel, Jesus. It says, "He shall eat curds and honey when he knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good." And then it adds, "For before the boy knows how to refuse the evil and choose the good, certain political events will happen." Again, it links moral discernment to a developmental stage.
Interesting.
And Paul, in Romans 7.9, reflects on his own experience. He says, "I was once alive apart from the law," suggesting a time of innocence. "But when the commandment came, sin came alive and I died." His awareness of the law revealed his sinfulness, implying a time before that awareness, before that kind of accountability.
Yeah.
And Romans 5.3 adds another layer. Sin is not imputed when there is no law. Meaning sin isn't formally charged against someone if they don't know the standard they're violating.
Right.
Even in Jonah, God's compassion for Nineveh partly rests on the presence of more than 120,000 persons who do not know their right hand from their left.
Generally interpreted as young children.
Widely, yes. Their lack of moral discernment influences God's mercy on the entire city. So these passages, taken together,
They really suggest that God's justice operates based on capacity, based on understanding and the ability to choose.
that's the strong implication. It suggests a period before full moral responsibility sets in.
Now, this next point, it feels incredibly personal and is often cited as maybe the strongest scriptural comfort on this topic, King David.
Yes, the story of King David and Bathsheba's first child in 2 Samuel 12 is deeply compelling. You see David in intense grief while the child is sick, fasting, weeping, praying, hoping God might spare him. Really agonizing. But then the moment the child dies, David's behavior completely changes. He gets up, washes, anoints himself, worships, and asks for food. His servants are baffled.
Understandably.
And David explains in verse 23 with this calm assurance, "But now that he is dead, why should I fast? Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he will not return to me."
I shall go to him. That's the key phrase, isn't it?
It really is. The overwhelming interpretation is that David, who fully expected to be with God after his own death, was expressing confidence that he would be reunited with his son in the afterlife, in God's presence. If he believed the child was lost or condemned, his sudden peace and statement of future reunion wouldn't make any sense. It's considered a bedrock passage for this belief.
Moving forward to the New Testament, Jesus himself interacts with children in ways that seem incredibly significant here.
Absolutely pivotal. We have these accounts in Matthew 19, Mark 10, Luke 18. They all tell a similar story. People are bringing young children to Jesus, maybe just for a blessing. And the disciples, they try to stop them, probably thinking Jesus is too busy or important.
Right, like they're a nuisance.
Exactly. But Jesus rebukes the disciples. He says, "Let the little children come to me and do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of heaven."
To such belongs the kingdom of heaven. What's the deep insight there?
It's profound. Jesus isn't just saying, be nice to kids. He's making a theological declaration. He's saying the kingdom belongs to those like them. Why? Because children, in their natural state, often embody qualities essential for the kingdom: innocence, humility, trust, dependence. It's almost impossible to imagine Jesus saying the kingdom belongs to them if, were they to die at that moment, they'd be eternally separated from it.
That's a powerful point. And he doesn't just welcome them. He points to them as the standard for adults.
He does. In Matthew 18, he takes a child and says, "Truly, I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven." So children aren't just recipients of grace. They are models of the humble, receptive heart needed to enter the kingdom. And then he gives that incredibly severe warning about causing one of these little ones who believe in me to sin. It suggests they are under God's special care and protection.
So beyond these specific accounts and verses, what about the broader picture of God's character? How did that inform this question?
That's crucial. If we look at God's revealed nature, it provides strong theological support. First, consider his justice. The Bible consistently shows God judging based on actions done and knowledge possessed. To condemn someone, like an infant, who literally lacks the capacity to understand sin, choose rebellion, or place faith. Well, that seems inconsistent with the perfectly just God the Bible describes.
Okay, justice requires capacity. What about mercy?
God is consistently described as abundant in mercy, slow to anger, gracious and compassionate. Psalm 103.8 is a great example. The idea of eternally condemning those who never had a chance to reject him seems contrary to this overwhelming picture of divine mercy, especially in light of Christ's sacrifice, which Peter says was accomplished because God is not willing that any should perish.
Right.
And then there's God's love, reflected in the Imago Dei, the idea that all humans from conception are made in God's image. God's love, demonstrated most clearly in sending Jesus, expresses his desire for salvation. It seems logical this love would especially cover those unable to respond personally.
And the sufficiency of Christ's work.
Absolutely central. Theologians widely hold that Jesus' atoning death is sufficient for all sin. So even if we accept the doctrine of original sin, that we inherit a sinful nature, Christ's sacrifice is more than powerful enough to cover that inherited sin for those who die before committing personal, conscious acts of rebellion or sin. His grace preempts their inability to exercise faith.
When you put all those aspects of God's character together, justice, mercy, love, the power of the atonement, it does paint a very consistent picture, doesn't it?
It really does. It suggests a God whose fundamental orientation is toward salvation and grace, especially for the most vulnerable and incapable.
The Bible also uses other literary forms, right? Like imagery, patterns, maybe allegories. Do those offer any clues here?
Yes, what theologians sometimes call types or typology. These are like patterns or foreshadowings in the Old Testament that point to later realities, often related to Christ or salvation.
Okay, give us an example related to children.
Think about the Passover lamb in Exodus 12. The blood of the lamb on the doorposts protected everyone inside the house from the angel of death. Crucially, that protection covered the entire household, including infants and young children. No questions asked about their individual merit or understanding. They were saved by the applied blood under that covering of grace.
Ah, okay, so that's a type of being covered by Christ's blood.
Exactly. It suggests a covering grace that extends beyond individual conscious faith, particularly to those within the household of God's covenant people, or perhaps even more broadly by his mercy. Another example we touched on earlier, the younger generation entering the Promised Land in Numbers 14, the rebellious adults over 20 were barred, but those under 20, described as having no knowledge of good or evil, were allowed in.
Right, that different standard again.
Yes. It provides a typological framework. God deals differently with those who haven't reached that stage of accountable rebellion. He applies a different standard, recognizing their developmental state. We also see children described as a heritage from the Lord in Psalm 127, a divine gift. This suggests God's special regard and, arguably, his mercy towards them, especially if they die before they could consciously turn away. And Isaiah 40.11 beautifully pictures God as a shepherd tenderly gathering the lambs, the vulnerable, which certainly includes children, into his arms. It implies he brings those who die young safely into his presence.
It feels like the narrative itself, the stories and images, lean towards this idea of special protection and grace, even without one single verse stating it explicitly.
That's a good way to put it. The overall trajectory and the recurring pattern seem to point consistently in that direction.
Okay, now we have to address some really tough parts of Scripture. There are instances where children, even infants, died as part of God's judgment. The Canaanite conquests, the flood. How do we even begin to reconcile those with a merciful God who saves children?
This is, without doubt, one of the most challenging areas. These passages are deeply troubling, and there are no easy answers that satisfy everyone emotionally. But theological frameworks attempt to understand them in light of God's overall character.
So how do theologians approach, say, the commands to destroy entire Canaanite cities, including children, in places like Deuteronomy or Joshua?
Well, the context often emphasized is the extreme, pervasive, and horrific nature of the wickedness in those cultures. Things like widespread child sacrifice, institutionalized ritual prostitution, deep-seated idolatry that God saw as utterly corrupting and needing decisive judgment. From our perspective, it looks brutal, but one theological interpretation focusing on God's mercy from an eternal perspective suggests something difficult but perhaps profound. If those children were to grow up immersed in that horrific system, inevitably adopting its practices and facing eternal separation from God, could their physical death, which ushered them immediately into God's presence, assuming they are below the age of accountability, be seen as a severe but ultimately merciful act?
So, saving them from a life that would lead to eternal condemnation.
That's the interpretation offered by some. It's a hard concept, viewing temporal judgment as a means of ensuring eternal salvation. It prioritizes the eternal state over the earthly one, arguing God, in his sovereignty and foreknowledge, chose the path that secured their ultimate well-being with him.
Wow, that is a very challenging perspective. What about the story of Elisha and the bears, the youths who mocked him?
Another tough one, 2 Kings 2. Youths mock Elisha, he curses them, and bears attack them. First, some scholars note the Hebrew word might refer to older teens or young men, not necessarily small children. Their mockery of God's prophet was a serious offense, but even if they were younger, the same principle could apply. Their death, while a judgment on their sin in that moment, wouldn't automatically preclude God's grace regarding their eternal destiny if they were below the age of accountability. It was a temporal judgment in a specific context, possibly removing them from a path of deeper rebellion in a place like Bethel, known for false worship.
And the flood, or Sodom and Gomorrah, entire populations.
Similar interpretive lines are often drawn. In contexts of overwhelming civilization-level wickedness, God's judgment, while devastating, could be seen from this theological viewpoint as mercifully preventing children from maturing into that same inescapable sinfulness, thereby ensuring their salvation by taking them before they reached accountable rebellion.
These are incredibly difficult passages. And that interpretation of mercy, it really pushes against our immediate earthly reactions to suffering and death.
It absolutely does, and it's vital to hold these interpretations with humility, acknowledging the deep mystery involved. We're trying to reconcile seemingly conflicting truths, God's holiness and judgment against sin and his profound mercy and love. Ultimately, we trust his perfect justice and wisdom, even when we can't fully comprehend his actions.
While the bulk of the evidence seems to lean towards salvation for these children, you mentioned there are counter-arguments or nuances we should be aware of.
Yes. It's important to acknowledge the discussion isn't entirely settled for everyone. Some theologians remain cautious, primarily because, as we said, there's no single verse explicitly defining an age of accountability or stating all infants go to heaven.
Okay.
Others place very strong emphasis on universal sinfulness, the idea that everyone is born inherently sinful due to Adam's fall, and the absolute necessity of personal faith in Christ for salvation, regardless of age. From this view, salvation requires a conscious act of faith that an infant simply cannot make.
So how do proponents of the age of accountability respond to that specific point about needing personal faith?
They would typically clarify that they aren't denying the necessity of Christ's atonement. Instead, they believe God's grace through Christ's sufficient sacrifice is applied differently to those who lack the capacity to respond personally. It's not salvation apart from Christ, but rather salvation applied by God's grace through Christ's work to those incapable of fulfilling the condition of conscious faith due to their developmental stage. This view aims to uphold both God's sovereignty and salvation and his character of mercy and justice towards the incapable.
Okay, so bringing this all together, After diving through the scriptures, the history of the theology,
Mhm.
what's the main takeaway for our listeners on this incredibly important question?
Well, I think the key takeaway is that while the Bible doesn't give us a single simple proof text sentence, the cumulative case, the weight of evidence, is really quite strong and comforting. You have David's personal assurance about seeing his son again. You have Jesus's incredibly powerful words, "Let the children come, for to such belongs the kingdom." That's huge. You have the fundamental character of God, his justice demanding capacity, his overwhelming mercy, his love for those made in his image, the sheer sufficiency of Christ's sacrifice. The concept of an age of accountability, supported by how God dealt with Israel and how Paul describes awareness of sin, provides a coherent framework. And even those deeply disturbing judgment passages can be interpreted theologically in a way that aligns with God's ultimate mercy, seeing physical death as a potential rescue from eternal separation for those below that age.
So the overall picture, the convergence of these different lines of evidence, points quite strongly towards a compassionate God.
Exactly. It points towards a father who embraces children who die before they can consciously choose him or reject him. It suggests he brings them safely into his kingdom precisely because, as Jesus said, the kingdom belongs to such as these.
This deep dive certainly explored a question that sits heavily on many hearts. Hopefully it's offered some solid biblical perspective and comfort.
I hope so. It truly highlights the incredible depth of God's character, his perfect justice, yes, but also his immense, overwhelming mercy and grace. Here's something to think about. If God measures accountability not simply by chronological age, but by genuine knowledge and the capacity for moral choice, what does that reveal about the vast reach of his grace? Not just for children, but potentially for all who might lack that capacity for various reasons.
That's a profound thought to leave with. We encourage you to reflect on that, maybe explore it further in your own study. Until next time, keep seeking.